Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. And, Jim, it was only a 4-day work week, and it still feels like Friday took a long time to get here. The Democratic antics were pretty exhausting with the Senate Judiciary Committee and elsewhere this week, so we're going to blissfully ignore them for the duration of today's podcast. But let's start with our good martini here. This is from Politico. President Donald Trump said Thursday he most likely, that's in quotes, will not shut down the government before this November's midterm elections over funding for his promised border wall, backing down somewhat from comments he made earlier this week hinting that he might take such a step. Trump told Fox News' Pete Hegseth that he likely would not insist on funding for a border wall ahead of November's elections because he doesn't want to harm Republicans' electoral prospects. Quote, if it was up to me, I'd shut down the government over border security, Trump told Hegseth in an interview conducted live in front of a campaign rally audience in Montana. And I guess when you get right down to it, it is up to me. But I don't want to do anything to hurt us or potentially hurt us. Government funding runs dry on September 30th, and Congress has yet to send any kind of funding bill to the president's desk. So, Jim, as we've discussed many times, whether warranted or not, government shutdowns are always treated as the Republicans' fault, whether they're completely in control, whether they have no control, other than perhaps to filibuster some things. So the media will always take the Democratic side. Getting that off the table and not having that as a cudgel over electoral prospects is a good thing. We remember how it worked out badly for Republicans in 2013, for example. At the same time, though, this in some ways seems like a preemptive surrender, which means we could get a really expensive budget bill here coming down the pike in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's worth noting that, earlier today, the new unemployment numbers came out. It's 3.9%. One of the really weird dynamics is that you have an economy that is, by just about every measure, roaring or doing really, really well. Some slight improvement on the wage growth numbers in recent months. The president's party should be doing pretty well. And obviously the polling numbers in the House don't look so good. The outlook in the Senate is pretty good. The last thing you want to do is throw some new sense of things are going wrong in Washington, that things are in chaos. They're all a bunch of idiots. And so there are two ways that the government shutdown fights can go. Most of them generally work out. At best case scenario, it's a draw for Republicans. It generally turns out bad. You inevitably get the school kids who saved up a lot to go across the country to go visit Washington, D.C., and they find the Smithsonian is closed and isn't it terrible, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we remember 2013, the Obama administration controlled the executive branch, and they had a ton of shutdown theater. We actually had our very brief, 12-hour government shutdowns earlier in the Trump administration. Minimal muss and fuss. My instructions to the administration were always going to be always make your funding run out on Friday.
Yes.
Because that gives you a Saturday and a Sunday. And honestly, the country can function easily 24 hours of a weekday, maybe even 48 hours of a weekday before people really start to notice and start feeling it. But once you get beyond that, you end up in a problem. And anytime there's a government shutdown, you're going to get some chunk of the public going to say, those idiots in Washington, why can't they get their act together? A pox on both their houses. And that never rebounds to the Republicans' favor. The reason that the 2013 did not hurt Republicans more is that people forget about a month or two after the government shutdown, that's when healthcare.gov rolled out. And I believe it was 6 people managed to get through the crashing system and successfully purchase health insurance through it. So again, this is a headache you don't need. 2018 already looks challenging enough for Republicans. You don't want to throw one more unexpected curveball that House Republicans are going to need to defend on the campaign trail. Also, you'd need everybody back in Washington to vote to pass the budget, to work it out, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody wants to be out on the campaign trail. So all in all, this is the fact that, I know the president had said something kind of a day earlier to the Daily Caller saying he likes the idea of shutdowns, but he said he doesn't like the idea of shutdowns. And so my suspicion is that we will not have one in fall, and that is one less thing Republicans need to worry about as they head into a election day where they're going to have some pretty significant headwinds and blowing in their face.
No, that's true. And just to fill in a few more details on the Friday jobs report from the month of August, Jim mentioned 3.9%. Average hourly earnings rose 2.9% for the month. That's the highest wage growth since April of 2009. 201,000 jobs created in the month. However, they did revise back 50,000 jobs for the previous 2 months, and we added almost 700,000 people who exited the labor force. So there's still some areas for improvement, but the wage growth is pretty exciting, and beating job creation expectations is very nice. All right, on to the bad martini now, Jim. And as you pointed out in our organizational email this morning, this seems kind of important, and it's being totally ignored. This is CNN. Russia has warned the U.S. military twice in the last week that its forces, along with Syrian regime units, are prepared to attack in an area where dozens of U.S. troops are located, according to several U.S. defense officials. Russia claims that there are militants in the area protected by U.S. troops. Moscow's declaration has sharply raised U.S. commanders' concerns that American forces would be at risk if a Russian attack goes forward, and it has sparked U.S. warnings to Moscow not to challenge the U.S. military presence. Several U.S. defense officials have told CNN that concerns center on a U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition base at At Tanf. U.S. troops help monitor a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around that area, given its location near the borders of Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. The garrison is seen as a key strategic location as the U.S., Iran, and Russia compete for influence in the region. So, Jim, this definitely deserves more attention. Anytime there's potential hostile action near or really disturbingly near our forces, it ought to be getting a lot more attention than Kavanaugh hearing theater.
Yeah, and it's kind of worth remembering. We're talking about things that don't make as much of a splash as you think they might, and kind of pass into history. Back in February, there was a clash between not the U.S. military and the Russian military per se, but U.S. forces and their Syrian allies being attacked by about 500 pro-Syrian government forces that included a significant number of Russian mercenaries. And because this is an audio-only podcast, you can't see me making air quotes. These mercenaries may not be quite so mercenary. They may be officially, for reasons of plausible deniability, operating on their own. But, the understanding is that you don't get that many Russian soldiers in one place without the Russian government having at least some idea of what's going on. It turned out to be probably the biggest clash between Americans and Russians, certainly since the end of the Cold War. The estimates are that 200 to 300 of the attacking fighters were killed. This almost certainly included quite a few of those Russians. The good news is none of the Americans at this small outpost in eastern Syria were hurt. There were probably about 40 of them there. Now, we didn't get much of this out in the public until later in the spring, around mid to late May. But, this is one of those things where people had warned. As the moment the U.S. started putting, small groups of troops, mostly for training and special operations on the ground in Syria, the Russians had their troops there, and it's, the possibility of a clash between the two of them was not inevitable. The longer this goes on, the more likely a bigger and more consequential clash becomes more likely. The other thing which is really intriguing is this is not the sort of thing you would expect if our president is a pawn of Vladimir Putin and a Manchurian candidate hypnotized drone who would never do anything Russia doesn't want. And oh, by the way, I don't know about you, Greg. If I were the Russians, I don't know if I would feel terribly confident about how Trump would react if Russian forces were to kill U.S. servicemen over in Syria. I don't know that Trump would be cool with that. I think Trump probably would react quite furiously to that, because the president reacts to a lot of things furiously. And there's really very little reason to think that he'd be nonchalant about something that I think would inflame the American public. So, look, this is just Russia warning. I suppose you could say the good news is that Russia is giving the warning, and they emphasize that they're informing it, but they're not asking permission. As you mentioned, Mattis and Dunford have pointed out that, look, we know the intelligence. Our guys can defend themselves if they're attacked. They don't need to ask permission. Hint, hint, Russia. Be careful. We advise you to stay out of this neck of the woods. We'll see how things shake out. But if something to keep an eye on the next couple of days, maybe it passes with nothing particularly dramatic or frightening or consequential. But if something does happen the next few days, well, we warned you on this podcast.
Jim, I'm just going back to this one sentence in the third paragraph here. And it has sparked U.S. warnings to Moscow not to challenge the U.S. military presence, which you just alluded to. Which Mattis quote do you think was applied in this situation? Was it tears in the eyes? I don't lose sleep at night?
I don't even know if he's got tears in his eyes at that one. I think it's safe to say that the Secretary of Defense is clear-eyed at that moment about the circumstances of the Russians.
I'm guessing it was short and unmistakable. All right, Jim, let's move to our crazy martini now. And yesterday we talked about the anonymous op-ed that appeared in the New York Times. I guess it officially launched on Wednesday, probably appeared in the paper on Thursday. The issue, of course, was this anonymous senior official in the Trump administration talking about how there's people in the White House doing their darndest to make sure that the president doesn't actually follow his horrific instincts, and there are people trying to do what's right for the American people. A lot of speculation going on, a lot of denials now from Trump administration figures that they are not the authors. Also reports that Trump is definitely on the warpath to find out who did write it. But the crazy thing here is that the New York Times thought maybe this put a little blood in the water for the Trump administration and Trump's hold on the presidency if they could explain that there is chaos going on in the West Wing. But now two people who are really familiar with White House communications are suggesting that the New York Times might not be the Boy Scout that it's portraying itself to be here. First of all, and I'm pretty sure, Jim, this is the first and perhaps only time I'm ever going to quote Jennifer Palmieri on the Three Martini Lunch. She is a longtime Democratic communications aide. I believe she was communications director for Obama, worked on at least one of the John Edwards campaigns. And she says on Twitter, "For what it's worth, based on my experience with New York Times sourcing rules for administration officials, this person could easily be someone most of us have never heard of, and more junior than you'd expect, like a deputy at Legislative Affairs or NEC, which I believe is National Economic Council." Then Ari Fleischer, the first press secretary for President George W. Bush, says, "The New York Times op-ed has two huge future implications. If the author is truly senior, a cabinet secretary or top aide, it's a blow to Trump and the aide. However, if they're a relative no one who the New York Times puffed up into a senior official, it's a devastating blow to journalism at the New York Times." And while the phrase isn't used there, Jim, it only fuels the idea of fake news.
Yeah, look, if this turns out to be Irving Schmidlap, to use my favorite fake name, by the way, if you suddenly see op-eds submitted by Irving Schmidlap, I'm going to be in real trouble. People are going to say, aha, that's Jim's fake name for some nobody. It must be Jim who wrote it. So if it turns out to be some deputy assistant secretary of corn cobs or something like that, actually the head of the Agency of Invasive Species at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to use another good example, the weed agency, still available at Amazon and fine bookstores everywhere, that people will kind of scratch their heads and say, well, that's really not the impression that was left by this op-ed. We very much got the sense that this was someone who had interacted with Trump, seemingly, if not on a regular basis, then regular enough. They certainly made it sound like the resistance was very high up in the administration, even in cabinet level and in the White House staff. I suppose here would be a good point to note that on yesterday's podcast and in the Morning Jolt yesterday, I had discussed the possibility of U.S. Ambassador to Russia John Huntsman being the author, and that several pieces of circumstantial evidence seem to fit that. For what it's worth, John Huntsman issued a statement saying, no, it's not me. Now, I would point out that there's like 27, maybe we're up to about this point, probably about 30 major officials in the Trump administration have said, no, it wasn't me. The vast majority of them are telling the truth. But if you are the author of that op-ed and you do not deny it, and you answer maybe or I'm not answering that question, you probably should have, and I'm offering my resignation today as the second half of your sentence, because if it's clear that you're the one who wrote it, the president's going to fire you instantaneously. And he'd have every reason to, not just for the leak, but for the sense if you're not on board with the president's agenda, the president has, I think, a perfectly, legal and moral right to say, look, if you don't support my agenda, go work somewhere else. Don't undermine me from the inside. No one's being, dragged and drafted and forced to work in this administration. So, we're in this very odd spot here. But if it turns out to be some low-level staffer, the president's going to come out of this, I want to say stronger than ever, but greatly enhanced it'll greatly enhance the argument about fake news, because the impression of this op-ed is that this is somebody senior, As I mentioned, it sounds like somebody who's been there from the beginning. It's just not that newsworthy. If, Irving Schmidlap, the third in command at the, Agency of Invasive Species, the Department of Agriculture, writes it, that's not news. Right? People don't care what the Irving Schmidlaps of the world think. I'm sure every administration has had lots of people up and down the chain, but particularly down the chain, who think the president is making a mistake and he's not listening to me enough and I would be doing things differently. That's kind of normal, right? What made the op-ed newsworthy was descriptions of the president's amorality, lack of knowledge, refusal to learn, all that kind of stuff, which really only comes, or we got the impression it's firsthand observation and from firsthand interaction with the president. If the author of it isn't interacting with President Trump on a semi-regular basis, well, then this is just a guy saying what he's heard and kind of, play acting as a member of the resistance and all that kind of stuff. And also the fair question of, how much authority do the deputy assistant undersecretaries have over setting this administration's policy? And just how much resisting can you do from inside the White House? So the New York Times is in a much shakier position than a lot of people think if it turns out that it's not a fairly big name. And let's face it, there's only about a dozen, maybe 24 people who I think people would consider to be a big name in this administration. And my suspicion is that, all of them have already denied it already.
The plot thickens. It's always fun when Deep Throat turns out to be a nobody, but we'll see if that's actually the case. Jim, have a great weekend.
Last time Deep Throat was in the FBI, but look, Greg, not like there's people in the FBI who hate the president, right?
No. That'd be funny if it was Peter Strzok, but it's not. Jim, enjoy the speculation game. See you Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Have a wonderful weekend and tune in again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.